This video goes over using sources to support your argument. It's a guide to quoting, paraphrasing, and summarizing for an argument paper in Comp 2. The first thing we want to do is review when should you cite a source, that is, make a reference to a source. You always cite a source when you use a direct quotation. That should be pretty obvious. Whenever you take a quote out of a source, you want to make sure that you have that citation. You also need to cite statistics. All numerical data should be cited because it was created by an entity and we need to know when and where that was created. Facts that could be challenged. Anytime you write an argument paper, you need to make sure that the facts that might be challenged by others, and these are the facts, not the claims, these types of facts need to be either backed up by a source or cited from a source. So if you're going to claim, for example, that China's economy is larger than America's economy, you need to make sure that you have a source for that. You also need to make sure that you cite summaries, and summaries are condensed content from a source. So if you take an entire work or entire article and you summarize it in one sentence, so you're just covering the author's main ideas, you have to make sure that you include who the author is. You also have to cite paraphrases. Paraphrasing and summarizing is the same skill. You're putting things in your own words, but paraphrases tend to be of something shorter. So you might paraphrase a paragraph or a sentence, whereas you would summarize an entire work. The 3 parts of documentation, which we have covered a little bit in class, but just as a reminder, you have the works cited page, which includes the list of sources that you used in the paper. You have signal phrases, which are those phrases that in the sentence that introduce the source, and then you have in-text citations. In-text citations are the ones in parentheses, also known as parenthetical citations. So we'll be going over all of this here in this video. So first off, though, we want to talk a little bit more about the best places to use sources, particularly when looking at an argument paper. One of the good places to think about finding a source to help you out is in background or context information. So if you are looking at your higher education topic, then if you need to provide some background to the argument that you're trying to make or to the big issue that you are trying to deal with, that would be a good place to use sources. Whenever you have to explain terms or concepts, often turning to a source is a good idea, not necessarily for the definition, but for help understanding the definition or how that term or concept can be applied. You always want to use sources to support your claims. So, and this applies to the entire essay. You are making one big claim in the essay. You are also making many smaller claims within the essay. And so those smaller claims, those main points, those need to be supported by sources as well. If you have one paragraph in your essay and you don't have any sources that you can put in there, then that probably does not belong in your argument. You want to use sources to lend authority as well. So this would be finding sources or choosing the sources that you have that show the best authority. So those would be the authors or publishers that have the most credibility. You can use sources to anticipate or counter objections. You can use a source to present the opposing viewpoint, but as the chapter explains, using the sources to support your refutation is a better idea. You want your refutation to be stronger than the opposing viewpoint because you're supporting one side of the claim. Other things to think about and keep in mind, you should not use more than 2 quotes per paragraph. One is better because you have that paragraph then has a focus and you're not including too many of somebody else's words. And then make sure that every body paragraph has at least 1 citation. Like I said earlier, if you can't find a source to support that idea, then it probably doesn't belong in your essay. So those are just kind of some rules to think about. They're not hard, fast rules, but they're good ideas to keep in mind. Ideally, you would also use more than 1 source per paragraph. So you may not use more than 2 quotes, but you would have maybe a paraphrase and a quote. And that way you have a little bit of balance. So when you are looking at this particular argument essay, you don't have that many sources that you're required to use, but ideally, you would be able to support your main point with more than 1 source. So let's get into some more specifics from how to use sources. And so we know the 3 parts of documentation and then the ways that we include source information in papers, but I want to go over some more rules for using these specific methods of including source information. So first off, with quotations, make sure that you are only quoting things that are worth quoting. So you're looking for phrasing that is distinctly memorable or striking, something that would be difficult to paraphrase. You can also quote words that add authority or credibility. So if your source uses a more credible source, so let's say you have an article by a journalist who quotes a doctor, the doctor is going to have more authority or credibility. Using that quote from the doctor would be a good idea. Keep in mind you will be citing the journalist who wrote the article. Always make sure you use quotation marks with quotations. That's a requirement. We talked about that in the plagiarism lecture. If you don't use quotation marks, you could have an issue with plagiarism. And always use a signal phrase. A signal phrase is an attributive tag. So it sort of works like a dialogue tag where you list the author's name or perhaps the source that it came from or both before you get into the quotation. And it provides a transition, but it also lends some credibility and authority. So this example comes from the textbook. One of the articles that you read out of one of the chapters was by John Leo. And so here we have the quotation. John Leo argues. Most signal phrases, if you remember this discussion, is author's name and a verb or according to author's name. Now, if you don't have an author's name, then you would replace that with whatever you put first in the works cited entry. So that's probably going to be a title from the article or something like that. So this is what it would look like for the quotation. And so if you're using something out of the textbook, remember, you do have those page numbers to add at the end. Otherwise, other sources that you get off of the internet, those you will just have the author's name or just the title. Summaries. Summaries are another way to use source information. First off, keep in mind a summary is a shortening of an entire long work. So main points from entire work, it's written in your own words. So we could summarize a book into one sentence. We could summarize a book into a paragraph. So summaries might vary on length. Typically, if you're adding a summary into an essay, you're summarizing an entire article in a sentence or two. You want to convey the main idea in a concise way. So you're looking at the big picture and putting it in your own words in the small picture. And you don't include your own analysis or argument. You're just focused on the author's ideas for this one. You should always use a signal phrase with a summary as well, because you're introducing the author and the source. If you're going to summarize an entire article, we need to know what article it was. And then you should always provide context for that source so that we understand why it might be summarized. Summaries aren't used that often in writing, but in particularly in a short essay, like an argument essay. In some of your longer essays, you may include more summaries. So this example here is in his article, When Life Imitates Video, journalist John Leo argues that video games are teaching and even encouraging kids to become murderers. So this is his whole main point. And then I have included the title of the article as well as his name and the word journalist to give some context. So that's all that we're doing. It doesn't have a page number because I'm not referencing something specific from his article. I'm referencing the whole article. And so that's how you can use a summary to give a big picture idea of what an author argues in an article. Paraphrasing uses the same skills. We are condensing things in our own words. However, a paraphrase is focused on something specific. So it might be one sentence, it might be a paragraph. A paraphrase might be longer than the original, it might be the same length as the original, or it might be shorter than the original. So unlike a summary, which is always shorter, a paraphrase might be longer. The purpose of a paraphrase is to communicate the main points in a clearer manner. So you might take something that would be maybe a little more difficult to understand and then put it in your own words so that it fits better into what you're writing. Make sure that the ideas are the same, but the wording and the phrasing are your own. So we discussed this when we talked about mosaic plagiarism or patch writing, making sure that when you paraphrase, you're not just pulling out a few words and then adding in synonyms for those words, but instead you are rephrasing the section or the sentence into your own words. The ideas have to stay the same, the facts have to be the same, but the way that you word it will be different. You should always include an in-text citation or a signal phrase. Sometimes students don't like those ones in parentheses, as in-text citations, so instead they include a signal phrase for all of their source references, and there's nothing wrong with that. Always check for mosaic plagiarism as well. This is where the Turnitin program can help you. But there's some other things that we've talked about in class about making sure that you aren't using exact phrasing from the original. So this is an example again. The realism in the newest video game graphics seem to be encouraging children to take pleasure in killing people. And so that's from the same section that I was looking at earlier for the other two examples. So you could see putting it into my own words and then the in-text citation at the end. The standard is last name and page number from a print source. If it's an online source, it'll just be last name. If it's an online source with no author, then it will just be the title. So whatever comes first in that works cited entry. So just a couple of examples for the works cited entries. This is if you happen to have a work with no author, you're going to end up with something that has just a title in the beginning. So you would skip over the author part. And then we have the title of the website, and we have the date and then the URL for it. So I have another video that goes over how to cite a short work on a web page. So you can watch that to get a better idea of how to do that. And then this is page 496 in Rules for Writers. This is the page that I will reference the most often for the class for documentation, because almost all of your sources will follow this pattern. So if you mark page 496 in Rules for Writers, you'll be going back to that. This is also included an example for a textbook article. We talked about this for the response essay as well, because this is what you used. But just keep in mind, you are using textbook articles for your argument essay, so you will want to use the same format for those works cited entries. So last name, and then the title of the article, the title of the book, the editor's, the publisher, the date, and the page numbers. So those are just two examples for how you're going to be working with sources in this essay. So that's the end of the presentation over using sources to support your argument.